Hi. So we now I will this time I will no, I will interview David Stout regarding his piece Interium. This is a piece which is like specially composed for VR technology. David, can you just shortly give some background of that project? Who commissioned and
Yes, it's a collaborative piece with the artist and programmer Cory Metcalf, and Cory currently works for Cycling 74. They're the company that creates and develops Max piece. And the piece Interium was commissioned by the Currents International New Media Festival. That is an annual festival that takes place in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I can go into a little bit of details about the work. The work is unique in the virtual reality realm in that it's a generative real-time VR, which comes with some difficulties in the sense of publishing, and it's not the kind of work that you download on the internet and then can personally experience with a VR headset, but rather it's developed for a festival for multiple, sequential, but multiple users. And it's generated live. So while the experience has a certain kind of aesthetic coherency always, the exact experience of one person is not going to be the same experience for another person.
can you just a little bit show because it's very interesting. You said it's for one festival, right? It's festival piece. Can you describe how it was shown in festival? So it was like it was like
Yes.
headsets or
Yeah, it actually is different in terms of VR in another way, in this the sense that it has two layers to it. So the piece is called Interium, which is kind of I'll compare it to the Russian dolls, where one doll fits inside the other. There's a very large screen. Sometimes we use more than one screen. A very large screen that is a backdrop that uses a similar technique as the VR to create this synthetic world, generative world. And then it's essentially a world within a world. So there's the world that everyone in the festival space, it's an installation show in this case, um, can view the participant wearing the headset inside the VR space. So the person participating in VR becomes a kind of unwitting performer, and it's set up that way, and it's not like discussed in any program notes or anything to make anyone self-conscious of what they're doing. But because the screen they're in front of is it's a it has the effect of a rear projection screen. So you can see the image on two sides. So if you're standing on the other side of the screen, you see the shadow of the person in VR. And the nature of the world, the interior world of the VR experience is such that it generates a certain kind of playfulness. Oftentimes, for instance, if dancers happen to be the person working with it, they want to start dancing. Kids will want to start crawling around on the floor or jumping up to try to catch something. So it turns out, especially on the backside where it's a shadow, it turns it into kind of a shadow play. So it has two levels, and one that a larger audience can actually enjoy the person having the interactive experience. And then when you go inside the work, it's a kind of of course, it's an immersive 360-degree um, world with very vast kinds of scales.
yes.
Like it's hard to actually put it in typical terms. Maybe not as large as looking at the Grand Canyon, but something very vast.
Okay. So as I understand, so there's different roles, right? You can you can play as a listener, so you can be more active or just observer, right?
Mhm.
And can you just tell me a little bit about concept of the
Um, Yes, so it definitely works in an abstract, with an abstract visual and sonic vocabulary. Um, and with that said, the sort of the generative technique is well, there's a number of generative techniques, but the software. Let me talk a little bit about the software, because that'll lead into this conversation. The software that we're using has been created in Max MSP, and it's essentially a kind of modular audio visual synthesis environment. And Cory and I worked together very closely from about 2006 to 2017 or so, and really pushed the software forward. Cory and I are not working together at the moment, but I've continued developing this software for both performance environments, and really intended for VR, actually. But it was relatively easy to repurpose it and add that element to it. And so in this particular use of the software, we have a database of various short video clips, and each of these video clips is an abstract textural space that has been used various kinds of generative techniques. That could be processed video noise. It could be some kind of fractal or weighted or tuned noise sort of space, various kinds of textures. And these can be selected at random, or they can be designed in a more linear way. And those surfaces, if you will, the content of those, the color content and the luminance, the black and grayscale content of those, is used to deform three-dimensional objects. And sometimes these objects are very, very large, and they might be more in the form of a plane, and so it's an easy way, for instance, to generate elements that look like mountains or icebergs or crags or canyonlands or things like this. Also cloud forms, ice formations. And then we have a second database of 3D objects that are not models. They're actually equations that describe three-dimensional space. And those can be combined on the fly in real time in various ways, like very subtle ways, to create hybrid forms. And actually you can combine more than one of them. And so in those cases, we take this layer of the video clip textures, and we use it as an intermediary between the fading of one form, let's say a circle, we'll say a globe, a sphere, and a plane. And we're extruding it, let's say we're extruding a plane towards becoming a sphere, using this weighted noise. So some elements are going to, that are, let's say, very bright, are going to shoot skyward, and the elements that are very dark are going to remain flat. And of course, we can tune that and weight it so that instead of something shooting skyward, it goes inverse in various ways. So that it's really actually quite a simple technique on one hand. Or at least a simple idea. It doesn't mean it's totally simple to realize. And then from there, mostly the same video clip, generative video clip. So these are the things that are not real time. They're a database. They could be generated in real time, and actually in a new version of the software, I am generating them in real time. But it's really hard on the computer system. So instead, we have this library that we can draw from, and we can even cross-blend them in all kinds of ways. And so we use that texture also to color the surface. So it makes these forms that have a lot of integrity in terms of they're sculpted in such a way and painted in such a way as they look very kind of natural formations. And so that's the visual vocabulary or methodology. Then simultaneous to this, there are two primary forms of sonification of the visual data. And the first would be those flat movies, those texture clips, can be sonified where we can select an area of that clip, and either in the color range or in the black and white range, we use that data to create an audio waveform. So in a sense, a video becomes an oscillator. And I use this extensively through a lot of different work that I'm doing. Mm-hmm. So it's essentially a wavetable oscillator, but where the wavetable can really radically fluctuate. So sonically, it can be a bit jagged and rough. It can have a really edgy sound. But using a basic sort of synthesis format, that's the generative sound. And then that sound can be run through various kinds of filters, resonators, delays, you name it. Everything that you do with an audio synthesizer can be done to these visually generated sound waves. Yes. So you can get a very clear one-to-one relationship between something's happening in the visual domain and you're hearing it at the same time. But through the use of delays or just sound design, the composer can decide to sort of minimize that effect or amplify that effect. So that is one method. The second method is a frequency modulated synthesis method that uses the 3D geometry itself. So you have an X, Y, and Z plane that is also emitting data. And this tends to be the sonification of change. It's going to be kind of static. It's oftentimes a kind of static noise space, but when these forms start changing, which they do in this methodology, then it creates all kinds of dynamic sounds. That one is a little more hard to control in a pitched. I should back up to the first method, because a lot of times people think there's an absolute, when you're sonifying something, there's this absolute, like, this is the sound that red makes, or this is the sphere makes. It's not like that. You can get these visual forms to emit a sound, but then you as the composer can define various aspects of that sound. And one of the important aspects is pitch. So it can be kind of a consistent pitch with different spectral elements, or it can be, you can assign the pitch to be changed by other elements in the space, or I can simply connect a keyboard to it or some other pitch tracking device and play it in a more conventional way. So it has all of those possibilities. So this kind of sound design is a lot of tuning, not only of frequency or pitch, but tuning in terms like spectral content, etc. That's a huge amount of it, because you're setting up a kind of aleatoric environment that can be totally chaotic. And typically what I'm doing as a composer in that space is sanding off a few rough edges and amplifying a few others, and sort of moving things around. So in a sense, I'm collaborating with the materials.
Very, very interesting. But if we look on not on maybe on the concept, right? But let's say as me, as let's say maybe not listener anymore, right? But let's say as somebody who is experiencing, right, this piece. What kind of central experience or central idea you have in mind? What I should experience, and because I think VR is about very much about sensorial stuff, right? It's
Yeah,
about
yes, it is.
how I feel in the space and what kind of effects you give me and what kind of experience you create me.
Yes, well, it was interesting. Neither Cory or I were that interested necessarily in doing VR because it seemed to be sort of a trendy thing at the moment, and we were like, yeah, we're just weren't necessarily that interested. And a friend of ours who was exploring it a lot, and who's another artist who is actually now working for Oculus, said, you really need to try this. And he brought all of his equipment, and we set it up and put some of the work from our performances into the VR space. And we were like basically instantly blown away by the experience of the scale and the immersiveness of it. And even though it's a synthetic reality, when you're immersed in that reality, it becomes very, well, virtually real. And it was quite powerful. So that drew us to this. Our performances, I should mention that the group that I have with Cory is called Noisefold, and we have done both performances and installations. And we decided this was more of an installation approach than it was a performative approach, and that it was very environmental. So I really tie a lot of this work to a kind of I don't want to say a rethinking as much as just a certain kind of unique take on ambient music or ambient experience and listening. What I would refer to as eco-conscious listening. So there's an environmental aspect to this, even though it is very synthetic. And I have a tendency, I would say, to not draw such a hard, I don't draw a hard line between what is the natural world and what is the man-made world and what is the synthetic world and what is the acoustic world. These things kind of, to me, are a little more non-binary and flow into each other. So, so it's very much an experience of an ambient listening experience, that you are in a world, but this world, unlike maybe the experience that we tend to have, at least Westerners tend to have, this world is alive. So I'd say that that's a kind of a core aspect of this, is to have the audience consider the possibility, which is, I think is an ancient animistic idea, that everything has consciousness, everything is alive, and everything is vibrating at some frequency, and in a sense, emitting a sound, even if you don't hear that sound.
Yes, yes.
And so in this case, that which is solid ground is still shifting, and ripples and waves come through it, and massive forms erupt and then subside, and large shards of light come down from somewhere very high. And so it would be perhaps if we did a time lapse of a certain kind of very dramatic natural environment, we did a time lapse and sped it up really fast, it would be similar to this experience. So it is a kind of amplification, if you will, of time scale. And so it's really aimed at putting people more in touch, surprisingly, with a different way of viewing their environment. It's suggestive that when you enter this zone, that you are entering a different kind of time scale.
Yes.
And let's say if in this realm that we occupy, we had lifespans that were 10,000 years long, and time it was moving at a much faster clip, and we were watching these things happen, unfolding before our eyes. I think we would potentially have a much different sense of what our environment actually is. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is that there's not really an attempt to be literal in modeling anything you've ever seen before, other than I can talk about geologic formations and ice formations are probably the closest that I can come to this.
But to understand, right, there is just, let's say, imagine, right? Can you imagine the same piece or the same experience, right, without VR? Is it possible? Or this VR element so that I interact, right? So that you create the sound and you create like environment of sound dependence on how I move in virtual reality, right? Is this significant difference for me as a listener?
Well, it's interesting with the goggles on, and in this case, I probably should mention that there's no magic transportation in this zone, and we don't use hand controllers because I'm taking it totally away from the game reality and from the reality that humankind is subjugating the environment. In this space, you are wedded to the environment. And so at times, and I named a few things, but one of the other things that can happen in this space is there are strange forms that arise and might circle around you. And sometimes they are sonified in such a way as to be somewhat threatening. They're both fantastic. It's just much like thinking about predatory animals that are oftentimes visually glorious, and they make all these sounds and they're incredible. But if they're 3 feet away from you, you may die. So it has it has those experiences as well. So in terms of, I'm always looking at the way one form is similar to another or could be translated to another. So for instance, could this piece be taken and done in a different way that's not in VR? Certainly it could. It could just be immersive projections, for instance. It could be more of a just a super large kind of immersive screen. Some of the, you could add, there is no live instrumentalist, but you could take some of the ideas and turn it into a performance. You could make a sculptural installation. There are a number of things you could do to translate it from one form to another. I mean, it's not unlike, let's say, a piano reduction or something of a larger chamber work or something. There are various ways one could go, but the VR does give this incredible sense of scale that would be very expensive and hard to duplicate in another way. But it would be with the proper budget, one could do it.
And as I understand, right, so that you use Max SP, right? And why not Unity? How was this?
Well, the really quick answer to that is that we were working with this instrument that we had been building for years. That's real time. And Unity is not exactly it can be used for certain real-time things, but it's a very different universe to work in. And we had the skills to work in this, and we weren't planning to do VR, it just happened. So with that said, the INTERIUM is like, Cory and I did a set of 3 pieces, and we were joined by our friend Riley Donovan on a couple of other ones, using this Max MSP real-time generated VR. I then went on to do another piece after that was really more of a study for using just a linear piece piece of music, not ambient, very conventional, just to see how that functioned in a VR space. And it was an experiment, and I wasn't totally pleased with it, but it did suggest all kinds of possibilities. And the first being exactly to do things in Unity, where it can be, if we're looking at a format that's more like you buy a recording, for instance, or you download a music video, making VR that is accessible to individuals that have the ability to experience it, and making it a shorter form, because the form in Interium is essentially, it goes on and on and on. It never, the beginning and the end is just where you enter the environment and where you leave the environment. Whereas something else could have some of those qualities, but it could also be a little bit more linear. So I have a feeling that that's coming, that's something that I'm going to do. I'm working with another programmer now that is pretty skilled in Unity. I have a number of students that are working that way. But there are also other softwares, so we're not sure where that'll go, but I'm pretty sure that we will do that in the future.
And what about hardware, right? What kind of headsets you used?
We were using the Vive headsets for this. And I forget which model. They're about 3 years old at this point. So there's a new generation out there. So it's the generation before the current one. I remember the model.
How you choose whether it was it was very important decision, or you can run the same thing for almost any headsets?
It should be able to work with the current generation of headsets. Obviously the more sort of higher end headsets, it should work with any of them. What the more important factor is computers. It requires a very powerful computer. So we use, in my performances, I often use, it's a mixed bag. I use PCs and Macs, and I more grew up on Macintosh, but for this kind of work, it's really PC.
Yes.
You have to use PCs. So we use Origin gaming machines. They're very robust, and they work out really well.
And how big was the team, right? So you were only two of you, or?
There's two of us. There were three of us, because Stephen Lucas also did some programming, but it's primarily Cory and I. And Cory is really the mastermind of the programming. I'm not a programmer, which is rather funny, because I spent the last decade and a half basically in software development and working with programmers of all sorts. So it's sort of the world that I'm in. But I mean, maybe this is a moment just to mention that my background is, I'm not also a conventional composer, because I essentially studied as a visual artist, and became very involved in electronic music and performance of various sorts. So I'm a performance director and an installation artist and a composer, and those things, once again, they cross over into each other in all kinds of ways. And I'm also a professor, and my students, I'm in the composition division in the College of Music at the University of North Texas. And my students, and mostly grad students in composition, many of them they're working in VR and video and performance art. There's this sort of great crossover between disciplines. And I also work with visual artists and filmmakers who are involved in these sorts of things as well. And I tend to bring them into dialogue with the composer. So we have a really fertile collaborative environment here to explore this kind of work.
Yes.
So it's certainly, VR is not just the domain of like visually oriented media artists. It is definitely being explored by a new generation of musicians.
And right, so you were two of you, and then I understand when you mentioned there was some kind of collective, right, involved in performance, or I just something misunderstood.
You mentioned, yeah, that the work that Cory and I did as Noisefold that
Yes.
led to all of this. So that was a duo,
Sure.
and we put that duo on. Cory is recently a father, and so we have put Noisefold on the back burner for an extended period of time, and now I'm working on a couple of other duos.
Got it. Got it.
And working closely with the programmer and composer Stephen Lucas. In fact, we are taking these kind of sonification techniques and visualization techniques in Max and developing a new environment using those techniques in Ableton Live, which then affords. I've been primarily not working in any kind of timeline oriented software for this, which I think is good because it forced the performative aspect into a completely different ways of thinking. But there are many things to be gained from being in an environment that has all of these, all of the many VS synthesizers and all of this audio material that's been developed. And so we can't do as many crazy visual things all at once in that environment, but for developing simpler kinds of visual music works, I think it's going to be really powerful. So we're having great success with that.
Yes. And what was the process of composing, right, or creating the piece?
Well, that is a really good question because I found it really difficult when I first started working in the VR space. You're sitting at a computer console, and a keyboard and a computer with all kinds of number boxes, multiple pages of data that you're entering and tweaking. But at the same time, if you want to actually see what you're doing, you need to be wearing a VR helmet. So the experience of that was the VR helmet goes on, it goes off, it goes on, it goes off. You're constantly switching focus. It's not pleasant. It isn't fun. I did not find it remotely as engaging as when you're really into working on a piece of music or you're editing a film or any of those kinds of things because it was so disruptive. And not only that, I started to wear I began to get a callus on my forehead that was also uncomfortable. So it sucked. So what that led to was the realization that this process was really a two-person process, that there needed to be somebody at the computer and somebody wearing the headset. And so that's where it's evolved in my work with Stephen Lucas. We can switch off who's doing what, but oftentimes I have him running the computer and I'm literally, it's sort of like a throwback to the days when I was more focused on theatrical direction. Yeah. I'm in the space going, okay, we need to move this a little over there and we need to widen out this sound, and it's more like that. And that is a lot more, it's much more effective to work as two people. And obviously, a commercial development, you would have teams of, your team might be 9 people or larger.
And how long it take for you and for you both to create?
I think that development for something like this is about and I'm leaving out the software development because that was ongoing. If I roll that in, it's much longer. But about 3 months, I would say. And in this environment, and that was another reason to work with the Max MSP environment, because it's a rapid prototyping environment. If you need to develop a little piece of soft component on the fly, it can be done quickly. And everything is real time. Unity is a lot more tedious, I find, but then I don't really know the software that well, so that would be obviously a factor. So I would say about 3 months once the software is created.
And tell me, so you created for this piece like special software as well, right?
The software existed already, but actually the way that Cory and I worked at any given time, that we had the base software, and then any given project always required more components. And since it's modular, it's more like a, working in the realm of modular synthesis. You build a new module. So we were always building new modules. But some of the central techniques that I discussed before, the use of 3D equations, et cetera, was always sort of at the foundational level,
Yes.
and we would reuse that over and over.
Got it. So if I correctly understand, right, you start with some kind of concept, right? And then from that concept, you understand what kind of modules or software components you need to build. So then you build it. And then actually this like, when you build the software, then this actually this actual composing work started, right? When you fill it with sounds, visual objects, and blending them together.
Yeah, I mean, it roughly follows a timeline of a discussion about what the piece is about or what we want to explore, the development of modules to specifically address that. Then there's a period of playing around, just seeing what is possible. And then going, and typically what I do then is I start sketching. And I'll develop, because this environment has a preset architecture like you might have on a keyboard synthesizer, even though we're dealing with literally hundreds, if not over 1,000 variables. It's a lot of number boxes. I develop these sketches and save them, and I might develop, 35 or 40 of them. Then we look at that and figure out which ones are best fit with the concept that we're working with, and also those elements that are most sort of integral to each other. And then when I'm working in a collaboration, we will play with those sketches and really flesh them out. It's kind of a similar thing to the way you hear that songwriters work that are co-composing something. But typically in those scenarios, I was the primary sound designer and composer. So I would go off on my own and work on that material. Now I'm working more in a solo. It's a different kind of thing. I'm doing more of working more in a solo way, but it's a similar production flow.
Got it. So what was like, let's say, what kind of new things for you discover during working on that piece?
I think one of the things that's been fascinating about working in virtual reality is being at the festivals and watching the audience, if you will, interact. And it's quite different than when you're a performer and there's a certain separation between you and the audience, and then it's a large group responding, and however they respond. This is very individual. And oftentimes there is a docent or a person, an attendant that is there to help the person put on and take off the goggles. But Cory and I would take turns also being that person, so that we have direct interaction with the person when they come out of the goggles and their experience. And it was very rewarding because of the most often people really had a kind of maybe even somewhat out of body kind of experience, or something profound happened for them. Children are often sort of ecstatic afterwards. Occasionally, someone finds it very frightening or claustrophobic and has to leave immediately. Other people are sort of afraid to participate. There's a whole range of sort of reactions, and it was just very interesting to be a part of that. So it sort of reinforces the idea that there is no one way that a person experiences a work of art. And there's oftentimes not necessarily that much of an opportunity for a composer or an artist to get that kind of direct feedback. So that was really cool. I think the other thing was how for people that are like what I would call kinetic type of people, specifically dancers, how much that it engaged that sensibility. And of course, you make one piece, and then that leads you to a new piece, and so one of the things that I would like to explore out of this notion of the sort of creating an ambient world that's sort of an endless possibilities within it, is to take this into a performative realm, where the person wearing the VR headset is a performer, and not just a casual, in the sense that I was talking about before, a casual attendee of a festival who may or may not have ever put on a VR helmet, but a person that is sort of it could be the ideal person would be a dancer who's also a cinematographer, and I know, and I have friends and students who fit this description, and build a world, but then navigate it and rehearse the navigation so that you can repeat aspects of the navigation, and then project that navigation on that experience on a very large screen. And that could then also incorporate instrumentalists. There are all kinds of various possibilities, or other set pieces as well. And I know there's some work being done with this, but it's in its infancy, and that has really huge potential and requires a certain kind of unique performative skill to do it correctly, if you will, just because typically when you're watching someone, the screen view of someone navigating a VR space, it's oftentimes, it's typically just like bad camera work, and it's kind of like, makes you seasick. So it has to be, we have to be carefully choreographed. But I think when we're also talking about a sonic world, because I guess I should probably really emphasize this, that in the performance work, and potentially within the VR work, one can manipulate, you can manipulate the visual form specifically to get them to sing, if you will. We could say play a tune, but I'm less interested in that than this sort of organic sound space that is not, it's maybe more microtonal and noise-based than it is like playing a scale, which makes everything look a little goofy. But you can manipulate visual objects to play the sounds within them. And in that sense, you could have even more than one person navigating a VR space, which is a kind of problematic. There are people, well, there's a lot of interest, obviously, in social media experiences, VR experiences in social media, where multiple avatars show up and multiple people are in the room. So that is obviously another frontier.
And what was the biggest barriers, right, which you need to overcome during the process?
Repeat that question.
What was the biggest barriers, right, which you both need to overcome?
Well, oftentimes the barrier, just instantly, it's going to seem very mundane. It's just the power of the computational system. because we always want to do more than the system can do. So you're always having to figure out where to cut corners. So one aspect of this is just the sheer number of visual elements that we're using. And this is where Max MSP is not, this is why working in a game engine like Unity is preferred, because you can't deal with as many live elements in the space. So that has to be reduced. And so visual complexity has to come about in some other ways. So that's a large one. Another situation is is working with sound and music in a visual art context where you're in an exhibition that has other sound going on everywhere. And that is not always I'm often more working in festivals that are either media festivals or music festivals. And so that is just that's not an issue, obviously, when you're doing something live or whatever. But if you're in a room with other sounds, then I pay kind of careful attention to how I create the sound world so that it will allow other kinds of sounds into the space and not seem necessarily out of place. And I probably should mention that as a detail. There are two layers of sound. So for instance, the background video is available on my Vimeo page, and you can hear how the visual images are sonified. The VR experience is not published, but the VR experience has its own separate layer of music sound sonification. And it's sort of designed for you, instead of putting a headphones on like really tight over your ears, you can kind of, on the Vive headset, you can kind of float them off your ear. So you're simultaneously hearing a mix between what you're seeing in the interior world and what is going on outside that any viewer would have seen before they entered. So it kind of gives them a sonic context, but the two are designed that even though they're asynchronous, to make complete sort of acoustic sense.
Yes.
So that might have been a limitation that we turned to our advantage. It's like, well, if you're trying to shut out all the exterior sound, that would be really a problem to achieve. But if you actually are welcoming it in, it actually creates this multi-dimensional layering. And I suppose that at the core, when we're talking about I'll talk about a sort of the metaphysical context of this work, because INTERIUM, this idea of a world within a world, is related to the concept of an interdimensional universe / the multiverse. And so it's a poetic way of playing with those ideas, which VR, because then of course we within the VR space, we embed more of that. So if one of these floating or organic forms comes near you, it is possible that it settles down, it comes down around you, and suddenly you're actually, you're in a room, you're in a world within a world within a world.
And the last question, maybe can you say some free suggestions to young composers, or not only young ones, who would like to start composing for VR technology, but they have never done it before, right? What would be like three main suggestions?
Well, of who they are, or is that the question? The names of some people?
No, not the names, but three suggestions.
Oh, I see.
Composers who want to start to something to compose pieces for VR technology, but understanding that they are, let's say, beginners, right?
Yeah.
In VR technology.
Well, obviously, visual composition, like sonic composition, requires some study or experience with just sort of the basic visual vocabularies. But I'm not necessarily a proponent that one has to sit down and study, study visual design and composition for 5 years before you would start doing VR. It's just, you can do this you can kind of do it simultaneously. I think consideration of, this is that's a great question. And I don't have just an instantly ready answer for you.
So do we need like let's say if I'm new composer, do I need to find some visual artist, or do I need to find some programmer?
Well, I mean, I'm actually working with students who they're composers. They have programming skills, and they have an interest in visual work. And so in the course of a relatively short amount of time, have moved from being a beginner much to becoming, I would say, an intermediate level in terms of visual. So that's one way to go, is a collaborative team, where you would have a composer, a programmer, and a visual artist. But given the kind of people that it's just the nature of being a young person in a heavily technological culture. Many students have already basic programming skills. They've been playing video games for like ever. They understand the navigation and of all of this stuff. In a sense, that is both a plus in terms of like fearlessness about exploring this. It's also a minus because anytime we've spent any time with anything, but in the realm of media, it tends to pre-wire us to a certain way of approaching it.
Right.
So
it's a lot of, let's say, preset, pre-word, and these schemes are coming from game experience, right?
Yeah. So I guess maybe with that in mind, the first thing I would say is, imagine what you can do in this game world that isn't like any game you've ever played before. It's like, let's take our imagination out beyond that, because these game environments are really powerful in terms of the possibilities for simulation. I would say for students that are wanting to go into commercial media related to this, then working with large teams of people and having the collaborative experience is important. But for, let's say, more of a fine art approach, where one wants to be sort of the author of the experience, working in very small teams. So for me, as I was saying before, I found that having one collaborator is really helpful. So that there's two people, but I do have a student who is really pursuing this very seriously, and he's doing all of the roles at once. So it's really there's not a right or wrong way to do it, but for people first starting out, I tend to think groups of 2 or 3 are optimal, especially if a person is coming more directly from a compositional background, and on the other hand, an artist that's coming more from a visual background. There's a lot that they can learn from each other in collaborating together, even if they ultimately decide to do solo work in the future.
So thank you very much for explaining your work and your piece. So it was very nice and I enjoy a lot of this interview.